Erased Horizons Episode 1, The Voice Outside, Part 3. Kole walked the lower medbay corridors, a restless energy thrumming through him that sleep could not touch. The recovered image of the tree, the impossible memory fragment from his patient, lingered vivid and sharp in his mind's eye. He'd isolated the image, run it through every pre-collapse Earth botany database he could access through the station's limited historical archives. It matched with almost 99% certainty a species of quercus, an oak, unmistakable. The leaf venation, the bark texture, even the subtle way the light played through its canopy. Details no simulation could perfectly replicate. He passed by a small, darkened, glass-walled observation room, usually reserved for contagious patients or those requiring extreme isolation. It was empty now, except for a single, stripped-down cot. There, on the wall, scrawled crudely in what looked like red nutrient paste or even blood, was a hastily drawn symbol. A circle, with a single thick line running vertically up through the middle, extending beyond the circle's top edge. A lift shaft? An arrow pointing up? Towards what? He cautiously entered the small room. The air inside was cold, still. The walls seemed to buzz faintly, a barely perceptible vibration against his fingertips as he touched the strange drawing. Static electricity? Or something else? He looked closer around the otherwise bare room. On the floor, tucked partially under the cot, was an old battered comms receiver, its casing cracked, its power cell long dead. Disconnected, forgotten. It wasn't standard medbay issue. It was much older, bulkier, a relic from a different era. He picked it up, a strange compulsion guiding his hand, and hesitantly held it to his ear, though he expected nothing but silence. Silence. For a long moment. Then, a whisper, so faint it was almost a thought, directly in his ear, yet seemingly from the dead device. "Hello again, Evan." He dropped the receiver as if it had burned him, his heart leaping into his throat. It clattered loudly on the sterile floor. But the voice, if it had ever truly been there, was gone, leaving only a racing pulse and the chilling echo of his name. In the suffocating, dusty shadows of the B-block air shaft, Jace finally felt the last tumbler in the ancient lock give way with a satisfying, oily clunk. He'd been working at it for hours, his fingers raw, his muscles aching from the cramped position. The heavy maintenance hatch swung open with a low, protesting creak, revealing not solid ductwork but an open void. He stared into the absolute blackness beyond. His small headlamp beam seemed to be swallowed by it, unable to find a far wall. It went up. Far, far up. Into a darkness that felt older and deeper than the station itself. He swung himself inside the opening, his feet finding the rungs of an old, narrow ladder welded precariously to the cold, sweating wall of the shaft. The metal was slick with condensation. His flashlight beam, jittering with his movements, caught faded, stenciled paint on the curving wall of the shaft. Access, level U7. U7, upper 7, 7 full levels above any known documented schematic of Station 6. His breath misted in the suddenly colder air. The metal rungs were cold and unforgiving beneath his gloved hands, each upward movement an act of faith in forgotten engineering. He didn't stop. He couldn't. The pull from above was stronger now, an undeniable summons. Mira, driven by an urgency that bordered on premonition, made her way back towards the known and monitored levels, navigating the labyrinthine service tunnels with an instinct born of long practice. She needed to find Kole. The message, "Do you want to go up?" and the earlier, equally unsettling, "Hello again, Mira," felt like two parts of a cryptic invitation, one that was rapidly approaching an unknown deadline. She found him just before the official curfew lockdown, in his small, cluttered office, the bluish glow of his main monitor reflecting in his tired, unfocused eyes. He was still staring, almost transfixed, at the impossible reconstructed image of the tree against a backdrop of what could only be real sunlight. The air in the room was stale, heavy with the scent of overbrewed synth coffee and unspoken anxieties. "I found a shaft," she said without preamble, her voice low and intense, cutting through the quiet hum of his equipment. In D11. The old schematics were right. It goes up, Evan. Way up. The panel was marked Tier 0. Kole turned slowly, his gaze shifting from the luminous image of the tree to Mira's determined face. The transition was like someone surfacing from a deep dive, his eyes taking a moment to refocus on the present. Tier 0. He breathed, the name itself sounding like a myth. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. I found a memory, Mira, he said, his voice equally hushed, gesturing towards his screen. A genuine, recovered memory fragment from patient 03 before they transferred her. It has sunlight, real sunlight. And that tree. They exchanged a long, loaded look. The air crackled with the unspoken. Two impossible discoveries, unearthed from opposite ends of the station's forgotten underbelly, and its suppressed consciousness now lay between them. They didn't need to say it out loud. The implications were too vast, too terrifying to articulate fully. Something was fundamentally, catastrophically wrong with what they'd been told about their world, their history, their very existence. Miles above them, in the cold, thin air of the undocumented shaft, Jace finally emerged onto a small, dust-covered platform. He was panting, his muscles burning, the old ladder having been a treacherous, exhausting climb. The air here was noticeably thinner, colder, and carried a faint metallic tang he couldn't identify. It didn't feel dangerous, not immediately, but it was profoundly strange, alien, like no one had breathed it in a very, very long time. He looked around, his headlamp beam cutting a swathe through the thick, undisturbed dust that coated every surface like a gray shroud. The platform was small, clearly a maintenance or transit stop, long forgotten. There was a single, featureless panel on the wall, dark and inert. But next to it, almost hidden by a protruding piece of rusted conduit, was a narrow vertical slit, barely wider than a credit chip. A keyhole? Or something more archaic? His fingers, stained with rust and grime from the climb, fumbled for the chipped access key he'd almost forgotten he'd swiped from Mira's toolkit during their tense encounter in D11. A moment of reckless opportunism he now hoped wouldn't backfire. He hesitated for only a second, then slid it into the narrow slit. For a moment, nothing. Then, the dark panel beside the slit flickered once, twice, and lit up with a soft, internal white glow. Words not in the station's standard utilitarian font, but something older, more elegant, scrolled slowly, deliberately, across the newly awakened screen. You are not alone. Jace stared, his breath catching in his throat. A shiver traced its way down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. He wasn't sure if the message was a comfort or a threat. Behind him, in the dense shadows just beyond the platform's edge, something moved. A whisper of displaced air, a flicker at the very periphery of his vision. He spun around, his heart leaping, his light cutting wildly through the darkness. Nothing there. Just the silent, oppressive weight of the unknown level, and the dust motes dancing in his beam. Back on level 6, in the relative familiarity of Kole's archive room, the doctor sat with Mira, the weight of their discoveries pressing down on them. He replayed the reconstructed, layered voice from the D11 terminal again, its enigmatic question hanging in the air. Will you remember who you are? Then, as if triggered by their shared focus, a new message flashed simultaneously onto his tablet and Mira's handheld, which she'd just reactivated. No sender, no preamble, just two stark, electrifying words in that same unmistakable amber script. It's time. They both looked up from their devices, their eyes meeting in a moment of shared, dawning apprehension. And then, precisely as the last syllable of that thought formed, everything went dark. Not just in the archive room. A cascade of dying lights and failing systems plunged their section of the station into an abrupt, disorienting blackness. Power outage. Unscheduled. Unprecedented. Throughout the vast, multi-leveled labyrinth of Station 6, lights flickered erratically. Systems began to reset, their emergency protocols kicking in with jarring, unfamiliar sounds. Alarms, rarely heard, began to wail in distant sectors. In the chillingly sterile, blue-lit depths of Control Unit 9A, Ansel watched the cascading system failure unfold on his hexagonal display. He saw his own carefully placed shadow tracking markers on Mira, Kole, and Jace blink out as their local sector grids went down. But this was no ordinary power failure. His internal diagnostics, running far deeper than standard station monitoring, showed a pattern. A controlled shutdown, a forced reset. A new notification flashed on his primary screen. External override detected. Protocol Omega engaged. He frowned, a minuscule tightening at the corners of his lips, the only outward sign of his internal processing. This was unexpected and unauthorized by any known station authority. He stood, his movements economical and precise. His earlier decision to merely observe was now void. The parameters had changed. Without a word, without a change in his blank expression, he turned and walked with calm, measured steps toward the reinforced door of the unit's restricted armory. Things were escalating beyond simple breaches of protocol. When the power dropped, the station didn't go dark all at once. It wasn't a simple collapse. It staggered section by section. It flickered, lights dying and then returning at half strength, casting long, dancing, untrustworthy shadows on every corridor wall. Emergency lighting, a sickly red, pulsed in critical areas, adding to the growing sense of unease. To the average resident, jolted from their routines or their sleep, it felt like another major technical hiccup, the kind that seemed to happen with increasing frequency, in an aging, overburdened subterranean structure running far past its intended design life. Annoying, certainly, but part of life in the depths. But Mira, her senses already heightened, her mind attuned to the station's rhythms, knew better. This was no random failure. She watched the flicker cascade, noting the sequence, the deliberate way power was being shunted and cut, sector by sector, level by level, not random at all, controlled, purposeful. She and Kole stood in the now pitch-black data archives, the only illumination coming from the emergency power strip on her handheld, and the faint glow of his tablet. The silence was broken by the distant, echoing clang of bulkhead doors automatically sealing, and the rising murmur of confused, anxious voices from the main corridors. He was watching the wall-mounted primary access terminal, which had flickered back to life, displaying lines of unfamiliar system code scrolling rapidly, vertically, like the station was actively, urgently reprogramming itself in real time. "This isn't a cascading failure," he said, his voice low and grim, echoing Mira's own assessment. "This is a targeted reset. A purge, maybe." "For what purpose?" Mira asked, already moving towards the archive room's emergency exit, her mind racing through contingency plans. "Or for whom?" "I don't know yet," Kole admitted, following her closely. "But I don't think we should wait around to find out." They moved quickly, navigating by the intermittent emergency strobes and their own small lights back to her private shielded workspace, the converted storage closet she'd painstakingly soundproofed and isolated from standard station monitoring grids. It felt like the only truly safe place left. Inside, the air still and blessedly quiet, Mira powered up an independent console, one she'd salvaged and rebuilt herself, hardwired directly to the old, largely forgotten transit grid's auxiliary power. She bypassed the standard diagnostics and accessed deep-core telemetry feeds, her fingers flying across the battered interface. "Someone triggered this from inside the core command structure," she said, her voice tight with concentration as lines of code scrolled across her screen. From a command level not even listed on the restricted access charts, a ghost level. Kole stared at the complex data streams, trying to make sense of the cascading alerts. "How far up does this control structure go?" he asked, the image of the Tier 0 schematic flashing in his mind. "Higher than we're supposed to know exists," Mira confirmed grimly, her eyes still scanning the data. "Higher than the station itself, according to some of these energy conduits." He hesitated, a new, terrible thought striking him. That boy. The one who'd been drawn by the voice. Then Jace. The name was a sudden, sharp exhalation. Mira's stomach dropped. Amidst the chaos of the station-wide reset and the messages, she'd almost forgotten the third youngest member of their impromptu group. She quickly keyed a trace command into the system, attempting to locate his transponder signal. A signal she knew he'd likely modified or was attempting to shield, but traces always remained. The boy's tag, self-modified, unstable, and broadcasting intermittently, lit up for a brief, flickering second on a ghosted access point relay high up in the undocumented sectors. Then it vanished as if swallowed by static. She rewound the buffered feed, her fingers precise. There he was. A tiny, fleeting data point, climbing an undocumented access shaft, past the U7 marker she'd seen on Jace's copied map fragment, higher still towards U8, U9. And then his signal was gone completely, absorbed by the unknown. "Damn it," she whispered, slamming her fist softly on the console. He made it through, or he walked into something that consumed his signal. "We need to go after him," Kole said immediately, his voice firm, a new resolve hardening his features. His medical duty to protect, perhaps, or something more. Mira looked at him, truly looked at him, seeing past the tired medic to the determined man beneath. The risks were astronomical. "We don't even know what's up there, Evan," she stated, the reality of it stark and cold. "It could be nothing. It could be a vacuum. It could be the source of all this, something that will unmake us." He met her gaze, his own unwavering. "We're not going to find out by staying down here, Mira. And if that boy is in trouble because of something that also called to us, I can't ignore that." He paused. "Can you?" Mira didn't answer Kole's rhetorical question immediately. Her gaze was distant, focused on the schematics of the upper shaft still displayed on her console. A map into pure, uncharted terror. Going up there, into the literal unknown during a station-wide security alert, with an unknown entity potentially hunting them, it was certifiably insane. But the alternative, staying put, felt like a different kind of death, a surrender to the ignorance the station so carefully cultivated, and the image of Jace, young and reckless, walking into that unknown alone. It gnawed at her. "Damn it," she thought, a reluctant admission. He was right. Up in the forgotten, lightless shaft, Jace crawled through a narrow, constricting tunnel filled with an almost suffocating silence and the ghostly caress of ancient dust. His small, flickering headlamp cut a weak swathe through the swirling particles that danced in its beam like disturbed ash. Every movement, every scrape of his knee or elbow against the cold, pitted metal sent clouds of the fine, powdery dust drifting away, revealing fractured access panels, ancient, corroded railings, and bundles of wires turned brittle and friable with unimaginable age. He passed a faded, barely legible sign, half buried in a thick layer of corrosion, its lettering archaic. Tier 0, Sub-Access 4. His breath fogged in the increasingly cold air, each exhalation a small temporary cloud in the beam of his light. He was higher than he'd ever dared to dream, higher than any station map had ever acknowledged or hinted at. The structure around him, no longer the familiar decaying utility corridors of the lower station, groaned softly now and then, not with instability, but with a strange resonance, like ancient metal remembering it once had a profound purpose. It felt less like a forgotten utility tunnel, and more like the passage into a sacred sleeping tomb. Ahead, the oppressive narrowness of the tunnel abruptly widened, opening into a space that felt vast and unnervingly different. A dome, perhaps, or the top of an immense silo. The walls curved upwards, disappearing into a darkness that his small light could not penetrate, but the ceiling far above held a faint, ethereal blue glow, like trapped starlight or a distant, impossible sky seen through a clouded lens. It pulsed with a slow, almost imperceptible rhythm. Jace stepped inside, his boots crunching softly on the floor with a sound like walking on fine, crystalline snow. A fine, silvery, almost metallic dust covered everything, glittering faintly in the bluish ambient light like a layer of frost or pulverized bone. It rose in tiny, sparkling clouds with each step. Consoles, their screens dark and featureless, lined the curved walls at regular intervals, long dead, their purpose forgotten. In the exact center of the vast circular room stood a raised platform, perhaps 3 feet high, ringed with thick, dark cables and an intricate latticework of thin black filaments that snaked out from it, disappearing into the floor, like the veins and arteries of some forgotten, petrified heart. As he cautiously approached the central platform, drawn by an almost irresistible curiosity, something in the room shifted. There was no discernible noise, no visible movement, but a sudden, distinct pressure change in the air, a heavy stillness, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath, anticipating. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled. He was not alone. Then, from the deepest shadows at the edge of the dome behind him, a figure. It wasn't breathing. He heard no sound of respiration in the otherwise absolute silence. It hadn't walked or made any sound approaching. It was simply there. One moment, emptiness. The next, presence. He turned slowly, his blood turning to ice water in his veins, his breath catching in his throat. It looked human, humanoid at least, in its basic shape and posture. But it was profoundly, terrifyingly wrong. Its skin, where it was visible beneath a simple, dark garment, seemed to shimmer faintly, almost iridescently, as if reflecting light sources that weren't present in the dim, blue-lit dome. Its eyes, large and dark, were unfocused, looking at him and through him simultaneously. And it was smiling, a serene, knowing, utterly inhuman smile that didn't reach its vacant eyes. Jace stumbled back a step, his boots crunching loudly in the silver dust, the sound unnaturally amplified in the sudden, thick silence. Who are you?" he managed to stammer, his voice a raw, terrified whisper. No answer, just that relentless, empty smile. And then it said his name, its voice a strange, layered chorus, like 2 distinct speakers slightly out of sync, one deeper, one lighter, both utterly calm and devoid of emotion. Jace. The sound resonated directly in his skull, bypassing his ears. You made it. He tried to speak, to ask another question, to scream, but he couldn't move, couldn't make a sound. He was paralyzed, caught in the unfocused gaze of this impossible entity. The figure tilted its head slightly, a slow, deliberate movement that was somehow more unsettling than any sudden action. "You remember the sky?" it asked, its layered voice soft, almost conversational. He tried to shake his head, to deny it, but he couldn't. How could it know his whispered question in the air duct? How could it know anything? "Soon," the figure said, its smile widening almost imperceptibly. Then, as suddenly and silently as it had appeared, it vanished. It didn't walk away. It didn't fade or shimmer out of existence. It was simply gone, leaving Jace alone once more in the vast, silent, silver-dusted dome, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Down in the lower levels, Mira and Kole prepared for their ascent with grim efficiency, the station-wide alert now a cacophony of distant alarms and garbled PA announcements. Mira quickly packed her essential toolkit, a high-intensity directional EMP device she'd borrowed from a restricted lab, and extra power cells. She sealed her small, hidden workspace, leaving a complex, looping diagnostic ghost running in her primary terminal to mask their absence for as long as possible. Kole brought a compact but comprehensive medkit, an old jury-rigged comms booster he hoped might cut through whatever interference plagued the upper levels, and, to Mira's surprise, a sleek, heavy-caliber energy sidearm he'd kept expertly hidden and maintained since his largely unspoken, off-world security consultant days before becoming a station medic. The sight of it was a stark reminder of how little they truly knew about each other, and how desperate their situation was becoming. "Are you absolutely sure you want to do this?" Mira asked, her voice low and taut as she secured the final strap on her pack, the weight of the EMP device a comforting pressure against her back. Kole finished checking the charge on his sidearm, the click as he engaged the safety loud in the small room. "No," he admitted, his face pale but resolute in the dim light. "Are you?" "Me neither," Mira said with a humorless twitch of her lips. "Let's go." They entered the undocumented access shaft not through the main D11 transit point, which was too exposed, but through a secondary, even more obscure maintenance crawlway Mira had discovered 2 years ago during a deep system exploration. At the time, it had seemed like an interesting but ultimately useless historical curiosity, a relic of the station's initial chaotic construction phase. Now it was their only lifeline, their only discrete path into the unknown. They climbed in tense silence for what felt like hours, moving slowly, methodically, the cold, ancient metal of the ladder rung slick beneath their gloved hands. The only sounds were their own labored breathing, the scrape of their gear against the narrow shaft walls, and the occasional deep, resonant groan from the surrounding structure as it bore their weight. The air grew progressively colder, thinner. Halfway up, or what felt like halfway, Kole, climbing beneath Mira, suddenly paused, his head tilted. "Hold on," he whispered, his voice tight. "Do you hear that?" Mira stopped, straining her ears against the ringing silence of the shaft. And then she heard it too, a rhythmic, incredibly soft, low-frequency pulse, seeming to come from far above them, and also from the very walls of the shaft itself. It wasn't mechanical, not like the thrum of the station's machinery. It felt organic, like a colossal, impossibly slow heartbeat, resonating through the very bones of the world. They exchanged a wide-eyed, uneasy glance in the near darkness, illuminated only by the narrow beams of their headlamps, then wordlessly continued their ascent, the mysterious pulse growing infinitesimally stronger with every upward foot. As they climbed higher, the nature of the structure around them began to change subtly. Less rust, less dust. The metal of the shaft walls felt smoother, the construction more precise, the air cleaner, though still cold. More intentional, as if they were passing from a neglected periphery into a core that was still, somehow, maintained, or alive. They finally reached a narrow, grated platform, similar to the one Jace had found, but cleaner, less decayed. It opened into a horizontal corridor, unlike the endless vertical shaft. The platform was empty. Kole immediately activated his medical scanner, modifying its parameters to search for broad-spectrum biological signatures. After a moment, it beeped softly. "There's life signs," he murmured, his voice tight with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Faint and unusual, but definitely there. One dominant signature, human or near human." Mira nodded, her gaze already fixed on the corridor leading away from the platform. "That has to be him, Jace." They followed the scanner's faint signal down the narrow side corridor. The air here felt distinctly different again, noticeably pressurized and with a strange, sterile cleanness, almost too clean, lacking even the faint metallic tang of the lower station levels. It was the kind of air one might find in a high-level biocontainment lab. The walls, smooth and featureless here without any visible conduits or panels, seemed to pulse with a faint, almost imperceptible internal light. In time with the distant, rhythmic heartbeat they could still feel more than hear. It was deeply unsettling, as if they were walking through the artery of some vast, sleeping creature. Then they found the source of the signal, or at least, where it had been strongest. The corridor opened into a vast circular chamber, identical in description to what Jace had discovered. The immense dome, the faint blue glow from the distant ceiling, the shimmering, silvery dust coating every surface. And Jace's footprints, clear and sharp in that undisturbed, glittering dust, leading towards the central platform. But no Jace. The dome was utterly silent, empty, save for the faint, rhythmic pulse that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. Mira turned in a slow, frustrated circle, her headlamp beam sweeping across the dead consoles and the undisturbed dust. Her earlier hope curdled into a knot of frustration and fear. "Where the hell is he?" she whispered, her voice harsh in the silence. Kole, however, wasn't looking for Jace. He had knelt beside the central platform, his gaze fixed intently on the thick, dark cables that snaked out from its base. He reached out a gloved hand and touched one gingerly. "Mira," he said, his voice hushed with dawning, incredulous understanding. This isn't machinery, not in any way we understand it. It feels biological." "What are you talking about?" Mira asked, turning towards him. Her attention momentarily diverted from the mystery of Jace's disappearance. He pointed to the cable he was touching, then to the others that formed an intricate network around the platform's base. "Look at the cables," he urged her. "The texture, the way they connect. They're not metal. They're not synthetic polymers. They're some kind of fiber, almost like nerve bundles. I think they're grown." Mira moved closer, peering at the strange, dark conduits. He was right. They didn't have the cold, rigid feel of metal or plastic. There was a subtle give to them, a strange organic texture beneath her glove. As they both stared at the impossible biological architecture, the faint blue glow in the distant ceiling of the dome seemed to dim for a moment, then brighten slightly, deliberately, as if the vast, silent chamber itself was acknowledging their presence, their discovery. Kole stood up slowly, his eyes wide, his scientific mind struggling to process the sheer impossibility of it all. He looked around the immense, pulsing, breathing dome, then back at Mira. "We're not just in a place, Mira," he whispered, a profound, terrifying awe in his voice. "We're inside something.